Fantastic. Well, hello and welcome. I'm delighted you could join us today for this talk on the G in ESG and what it actually means. We're going to be covering that and the results of research we've been doing with investors on fund governance, and we're also going to be talking about how fund governance will be changed by ESG. On the panel today, we have Chris Addy, who is the CEO and president of Castle Hall, an investor due diligence firm based in Montreal, but with clients all over the world. We have Lynn Carrero, the senior vice president with Greyline Partners, a compliance firm with offices across the US and in London, but Lynn is in Boston. We have Ekwe Nabaza, who is counsel with law firm Lowenstein Sandler in New York. We have Philip Parecki, who is head of business development for Jersey Finance in the US and is based in New Jersey. And we have Charlotte Valeur, who's the founder of the Global Fund Governance Group, and she launched something called Broad Apprentice, and also for a time was the head of the Institute of Directors here in London. I'm delighted so many of you can join us today. The majority of the audience, which is well over 100, is in the US. My name is Simon Osborne. I am the CEO of IFI Global, which is an asset management research and a media house based in London. We currently have 3 publications, and one of them is the NED, which focuses on fund governance. I say we've currently got 3 publications because in September we will be going up to 4 as we are launching a publication for US managers, advisors and others who want to know more about what is going on in this business outside the US. We aim to provide expertise and advice on fund structuring issues for US managers going overseas at a time when the business is changing very rapidly for a number of unrelated reasons. And finally, before starting, I would like to thank Jersey Finance very much indeed for sponsoring this event today. And we hope to be back in person with them in New York later this year. So I'm going to give a very short introduction presentation, then we're going to get into the panel discussion. You just see what is happening here. Hey, hopefully this will, oh, that's fantastic. Here we go. So as I say, there's 3 things we're going to talk about. One is the G in ESG. What is it? We're going to also talk about the results of research we have been doing with investors on fund governance and how will fund governance be changed by the ESG era ahead. So what is the G in ESG? In one level, it's incredibly simple and very obvious. It applies to any industry in all industries all over the world. It's simply about how organizations are actually run. But I am going to start off with a very contentious statement here, and that is that in how the fund management industry is run and their boards isn't necessarily as well isn't as well run from an ESG point of view as it should be, and not every fund manager, but a number of fund managers are guilty of what we've just started calling governance washing. Now, you may have heard of greenwashing. Some people will also use the term social washing. We've come up with the term governance washing. What is governance washing? Governance washing is fund managers demanding of corporates, for example, to be more diverse, to be more environmental, et cetera, all the good metrics of ESG, but failing to do any of that themselves. And there are plenty of examples of that. One perhaps is early last year, Goldman Sachs Asset Management made a very big public announcement that they would only invest in firms with at least 1 woman on the board. Other fund managers, I want to just pick out them, have said very similar things to that. But when you look at the board composition, I'm going to touch upon this in a second, you will see that the fund management industry have failed to do that themselves. Also, fund managers do remarkably poorly in Refinitiv's D&I, which stands for Diversity and Inclusiveness Index. There's only one asset manager, which is BlackRock, which is in the top 100 in the Refinitiv D&I index, but there are plenty of firms like KPMG, Accenture, etc., all those type of firms that actually do very well in it. So there's no reason why fund managers do as poorly as they do. So I'm now going to illustrate the point I was making about fund managers' boards, and another point, which is the variability of the standards of managers, by showing you work one of our researchers did earlier this year on the boards of, these are international boards of many very well-known fund managers. She did analysis on, I think it is here, yes, over 1,018 fund boards from many of the most best-known, but predominantly alternative asset management houses. What she found was the average board size was 3.44. The average number of independents on those boards was 71%. The number of boards with independents who are quote-unquote independent from each other is 79%. The number of females on those boards was just 19%, 19%. And we've done similar analysis on the asset manager, not the funds, but the asset management boards of the big UK asset managers. And the number of females on their boards is quite similar to that. And that's in spite of the fact that here in the UK, the FCA, which I'm sure you all know is very equivalent to the SEC, mandated that UK authorized fund managers had to include 2 independents onto their boards in the last couple of years. Many of the UK managers failed to take that opportunity to diversify their boards. Now, I'm going to quickly move on to the highlights of a research study we've been doing with investors. These aren't the final results. We even had a result coming in from a big pension fund in Canada just an hour or two ago, but they're close to the final results. The final results will be published very shortly, and we'd be delighted to send the full results to any of you that would like to see that, and they will be published also in this month's issue of the NED. So the first, these are predominantly big institutional investors, predominantly pension funds and their advisors, I should add. Quite a lot of the research was done with the advisors to those entities. And so the first question, do you think that ESG considerations will have an impact on fund governance? 53% said yes. I was expecting it to be higher than that, but as I said on the prep call, if you'd asked that question 2 years ago, it wouldn't be anything like 53%, I doubt very much. Ditto, if you ask the question in a year or two's time, I would confidently bet that it will be quite a lot higher than 53%. And slightly disappointing, but nonetheless very interesting results is we asked these investors how important to them is fund governance. Only 7% said it was very important. The overwhelming majority, there 86% said it was helpful, but not that important. And even the same number as said as very important said it really wasn't important at all. Those who were the more skeptical about it tended to say it just doesn't make enough of a difference for them. If they want to have operational certainty, if they really want to get to know what's going on at the fund, then they're not going to be going to the directors of the fund for that information. They're going to go into the fund management company itself, or even to the service providers. The board is just not actively involved enough, for those that are skeptical, for them to make enough difference. This is probably a very unsurprising result, particularly if you're asking investors, what is the purpose of fund governance? Because, I mean, you could say that the interest of the fund and the interest of investors should be aligned. And obviously, a lot of the time they are, but they can diverge, and they have diverged. So we asked investors, what was the primary purpose of fund governance? And unsurprisingly, all of them have said it is first and foremost to protect the interests of investors. And then we also asked them what was important for them and the directors of the funds they're investing with, what qualities. Experience, as often when we've done these surveys in the past, comes top, independence very close to it. Gender diversity somewhat trailing behind that. that again may change in the coming years, who knows. Final two questions from this survey. And this is something that has come up a lot. No one, as far as I'm aware, has done anything about it. I do not know of a jurisdiction that has imposed term limits, but I think perhaps that should come. So the overwhelming majority of investors clearly think it's time for term limits. The question is, what would the term limit be? Typically, at least here in the UK, I think under the rules here, it's for any corporate should be, it's just under 10 years, it's 9 years or something like that, that length of time. So it's still a decent length of time, but eventually you should give up that position is the view. And this last one is a very matter very dear to our hearts at IFI Global / the NED, which is, would you like publicly available analysis on the composition of fund boards? We were pleased to see the vast majority of respondents said they would, but there was some skepticism to a certain extent. I don't think they're all, waiting for it to happen, that they're not charging around asking for it or begging for it. Somebody even asked me, well, would we have to pay for it? I said, no. Okay, fine then. So if it's sort of in the category of more information, then why not? I think that's the way probably to view that particular result. Finally, before getting into the panel, these are the big questions that we're going to frame for the rest of this discussion, and we'll doubtless go off in many different directions. And by the way, you're very much encouraged to ask questions as we go along. We'll try and take them as many as we can. We might leave a few minutes for other questions at the end. So please chip in with, use the Q&A button and ask questions as we go along. Can fund governance be made more helpful to investors? If so, how? How helpful would more transparency be in the documentation of the selection process, fund board composition, etc.? How much more helpful would more transparency be in improving standards? And how much will the adoption of ESG business practices by fund managers and their boards help improve fund governance? So I'm now going to stop sharing screen and bring the panel up. Great, that will work for you. And I'm going to ask them all to make brief introductory comments, and then we will get into the Q&A session. So Chris, can I come to you first for any reaction to anything I've said just now, and any other comments by way of introduction you would like to make?
Thanks, Simon, and first of all, thank you very much again for yourself and IFI to put together these events. It's just very helpful to have a forum where we can meet and exchange ideas on these topics. I think it's a really interesting time. I love the phrase governance washing, which of course can mean either really sort of not doing a great deal or as much. Following more detailed, granular procedures, which ultimately turn out to be more form-filling and box-checking than necessarily bringing true professional skepticism, independent thought, and governance to the fund management structure. I think overall that the debate is changing and evolving. Really, a lot of the attention to governance came in the aftermath of 2008 and the GFC, the global financial crisis, which shockingly is now nearly 13 years behind us. And it's amazing where time goes. And a lot of the questions we had at that time, it was particularly focused on hedge funds. The issue was oftentimes offshore hedge funds, typically in the Cayman Islands, suspending redemptions, inability for investors to access their capital, concerns about jumbo directors, a small cabal of individuals who were unable to discharge their governance responsibilities as they were evidently sitting on a lot of funds, however many hundreds or thousands that may be. I actually have a very simple rule conducting due diligence. If I'm talking to a director who can't tell me from memory all of the funds that they are a director of, they're on too many, which I think seems to be a sort of a fairly practical yardstick. But I think a lot of those questions, some of the most egregious examples have moved away. Your survey indicated that a strong majority of funds have independent directors. The majority of those funds have split boards where the directors are not provided by the same corporate governance secretarial services provider. So we have a degree of independence there. So I think we're moving to a different paradigm of governance effectiveness. And I think the 2 or 3 points that I would raise, I think the biggest challenge for investors is to think about consistency in governance practices across their portfolio. It is still quite remarkably siloed by asset class. So for example, when I am talking about private equity, real estate, infrastructure, venture capital, some elements of private debt, alternative credit, I'm talking about closed-ended funds, and the terminology is GPLP. It's not investment manager and investor, it's GPLP, which by definition mandates that the fund is structured as a partnership where, ergo, there is no board of directors, there is no independent governance. I might have a limited partner advisory committee and LPAC, but all of the members of those at that LPAC will be very quick to tell you that they don't want any legally binding governance responsibility as members of that body. On the flip side, if I look at a diversified portfolio of a large pension plan, sovereign wealth plan fund, they may be invested in listed infrastructure vehicles. They may form their own vehicles. They may have managed accounts, funds of one. They may be investing directly into corporate entities. They may be investing in funds that qualify under different regulatory and equivalent regimes, such as ERISA, 40 Act registered funds. There really is it's becoming ever more apparent that the dispersion and divergence of governance quality by asset class is very interesting and difficult to square the circle as to how institutional investors continue to have such a wide variety of different governance structures. And of course, that segues into the concurrent, rapidly emerging, and in my mind, rapidly dominating elements around ESG and the role of effective governance to really be a focal point and catalyst for changing behavior and creating greater alignment, better outcomes across multiple levels of the investment industry for end beneficiaries and asset owners. I think it's going to be very interesting. So I think governance remains a key issue, but it's more multifaceted. And if we look forward, new issues are coming on the table rather than our traditional debates of, well, how come is it that a person X is on however many boards it may be.
Okay, thank you. Right, we're going to alternate accents by way of panel. So I think we should come to an American accent next. Lynn, should we come to you for some brief opening comments?
Sure, I will follow up with that. Thanks for having me. I am a senior vice president with Grayline, and I'm coming at it from more of an objective industry observer. And probably more so focused on the impact of regulation to fund governance. So one of the things, Simon and panel, when I was going through, I think there's a big difference in approaches between private boards and public boards. So meaning mutual funds, registered funds, UCITS. There seems to be a much stronger, almost regulatorily mandated governance structure for those kinds of funds as opposed to the private fund sector. So if you think about it, the Investment Company Act has 38A1, and then there are all additional kinds of requirements placed on directors in terms of audit committees and valuation responsibilities. And just as kind of an extra, I wanted to see what would happen if I Googled fund director of mutual fund and fund director of private fund. And what my results yielded for the mutual funds was a number of legal arguments and enforcement action from 2013, and full discussion of different groups and industry groups who are representing those directors, as well as a number of law firms who are happy to be director counsel. When I Googled fund director of private funds, I got a list of the directors at the SEC. I got a list back to the 1940 Act, and I have to admit I had to go quite far down the search results before I actually came across anything that was referencing being a director of a private fund. So I think, you know, that was one of the things I found really interesting. The other thing I found interesting in the topic and on a going forward basis are, again, the kinds of conflicts. And I think Chris alluded to one of the key ones, which is the number of boards, and is it possible to provide effective governance to large numbers of institutions? Can you actually keep your hand kind of on what's going on in that many? The other aspect, I do a lot of work in the private fund sector, and I think one of the key conflicts there is that typically the manager vis-a-vis the GP, although they are separate entities per se, they're typically the same people. They actually, you know, have control over the fund board and the hiring and the firing. So even though the board really is meant to be representing the fund, you know, we see that the manager actually may be in a position of control because of the compensation factor. So, you know, while a director may want to be independent, there also has to be sort of in the back of their head, well, if I don't do what the manager wants me to do, are they just going to fire me? So those are kind of the different areas, the divergence and the conflicts that I've been focused on in my career in SEC compliance, and kind of the things that I'll be interested to see what comes out as we move forward and what my fellow panelists have to think about some of those areas.
By the way, I should have said we're doing a fascinating study with Greyline in the US right now on managers' ESG practices, business practices. We're sort of halfway through the studies, yielding some really interesting results. So we may at the very end talk a bit more about that. Charlotte, can I come to you? I was going to say alternate accents across the Atlantic. Your accent is more Danish than English, but over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for the other panelists, very insightful comments. So I am a director on various boards, and I serve currently on 6 different boards, and that is my full-time occupation. I do feel that the financial crisis has been forgotten very quickly, and we haven't really seen, I think, appropriate changes being pushed for. After that, I mean, there was large uproar when investors realized that there were gates put in, and there was a couple of years of interest in the governance, but then it faded away again. I tried to sort of propose a public summary of reviews of the governance of the boards, and interestingly, the investors didn't really want that. The managers were actually open to it. If our investors want it, we'll do it. But then when speaking to investors, they said, well, what if we see something we don't like and we want to be invested in the manager? And I was like, well, what does that tell you if you see something you don't like? And the interesting thing was that it was just not that easy to engage with investors on them actually pushing for governance. And clearly the test, the questions you have asked, Simon, shows that actually they still don't really care, right? And it's a shame, because the day everything goes wrong, they suddenly do care. And then you have directors that might have tried to push for some changes, such as myself, but unable to, because investors keep signing up to status quo. I mean, for example, it's kind of hard as a director to push for change in documentation so that the manager doesn't have primacy over the board, when the investors keep signing those documents and signing up to them and be happy with that. If we could all come together and say, actually, what are we happy with and what are we not happy with? I personally don't really like being on boards where it's in the hands of the manager, because it's not the manager I'm there to protect. It's the investors and the wider society. So it's something that I would really like to see change. But again, as I said, it's kind of hard when investors don't take enough interest in that.
Thank you. And Ekwe, can I come to you?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. This is great, and thank all the panelists for their insights so far. I come at fund governance from the lens of fund counsel primarily, though I have performed as LP counsel in my career. Most of my work has been on behalf of fund managers, and to the extent that fund managers view fund governance, they view it from the lens of it's something that they need to check the box to. It's something that is regulatorily required in the case of offshore corporate entities. It's not really, and it's often a cog in the wheel for them to get their work done. When you think about private funds, these are funds that are typically not very well or not very highly regulated. And people, the managers enter or form these funds specifically to not have that constant oversight. So it's sort of in the culture of private funds to sort of eschew fund governance because they like to be the titans or the kings of the castle. They are the ones who are running the funds. The returns are based on their ideas, their work, and in their minds, as long as the investors are getting good returns, there really should be no questions or oversight. And I think that I started my legal career right before the financial global crisis. So I think it has informed my practice to a certain extent. And I think that if fund managers could come to see fund governance not as something other, something punitive, something that adds bureaucracy to them just getting their work and job done, I think that would help move us towards a more a better relationship with fund governance. And also, if fund governance was actually, if investors could see how fund governance would actually improve matters, I think that score or that question about the importance of fund governance would be quite different. And how do we get there? I think that if there was a concerted effort to come up with guidelines, theories, or things to look for in the same way that ILPA does it for partnership agreements, if there was a body that would do that for fund governance, right? What questions need to be asked of the board? What questions does a board have to opine on? What information does the board have to see? And how regularly does that need to be reported? Are you just reporting on an annual basis and sort of giving a gloss over the performance? Or is it more of a, or more regular touch point about what is going on in the fund? Do the directors have that information? Things like that, I think, would help shift the narrative about fund governance to be something that's more acceptable, more well thought, better thought of. And I think that generally in the atmosphere, especially in the United States, with the conversations about the composition of corporate boards and the push that investors are having for the fund to the funds to make sure that the portfolio companies that they're invested in at least in the private equity sector, reflect the diversity and inclusion aspects of the greater society, I think will eventually, if the investors push for it, also have an impact on fund governance.
Thank you very much. And Philip, finally to you before we get into the Q&A?
Thank you, Simon. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Philip Parecki. I'm the business development lead for Jersey Finance in the Americas. Jersey Finance is the industry body that represents the finance industry in Jersey. And so, predictably, I'm going to approach today's topic from a jurisdictional perspective. And that said, I'd like to start by putting the G back into ESG for just a moment and discuss the topic a little holistically. So, ESG has become part of the investment lexicon over recent years, and it's growing exponentially in significance. And in a survey that we commissioned earlier in the year, all of the investors surveyed noted that ESG criteria is going to play an increasing role in the selection of service providers, fund domiciliation, and ultimately allocation decisions. And so what this makes clear is that ESG considerations are accelerating and investment managers are responding. And I believe over time that we will see managers who want to access global markets will have to comply with investor requirements. Similarly, jurisdictions have started to understand, although not necessarily respond to the same set of demands and expectations. And I expect that this to be the next step. So, for example, Europe with the implementation of SFDR in March of this year. But in terms of the allocations themselves, Deutsche Bank expects that ESG assets are likely to surpass 100 trillion by 2028, with Bloomberg and PwC making similar forecasts. Now, these forecasts imply that ESG will permeate all areas of alternatives, as well as the more conventional long-only investment space. And what we've seen historically is that asset classes congregate in jurisdictions, and there is an opportunity for a single jurisdiction to lead in the ESG space. And I believe that will be Jersey. Now, since ESG means many things to many people, there is no single route to achieve this. But along with Jersey's key advantages of political and economic stability, Jersey has the potential to lead. And it is the culmination of a stratagem based on the work of our government, our regulator, and Jersey Finance. So Jersey Finance has led the Jersey for Good project, which sets out a defined plan to accelerate a journey towards a sustainable future leading up to 2030. And these initiatives are underpinned by Jersey for a Wider World program, which allows, of course, us to have a substantive conversation. Again, a collaborative effort between government, the regulator, and commerce. Now, I think all of these things collectively shape our credibility in the space, which is not so much a regulatory issue, but rather a mindset, a point that was raised just a moment ago. This is really what lies at the heart of our strategy, fostering and then harnessing a shift in mindset to help put Jersey in a position of ESG leadership. Now, that's why we treat ESG in a holistic way, looking at how we can embed it across all sectors and inculcate it into business practices. Now, finally, bringing it back to today's topic, the G in ESG, Jersey already has a running start here with the depth of experience, skill sets, and as importantly, our governance standards. So real substance backed up by deep pools of talented and experienced professionals, all of which I hope we'll explore in further detail as we go into this discussion. And so with that, Simon, let me turn it back over to you.
Okay, well, let's get back, thank you. Let's get back into the Q&A. This is a question I really want to start off, which perhaps as challenging as you're going to get is, can fund governance be made more helpful to investors? Because that is really what it's all. I think there are two things here, which we touched upon on the prep call. One is getting investors more involved, and the other is transparency. We'll come on to that perhaps a bit later. But can it really, in practical, realistic terms, can it be made more helpful? Perhaps we should go to you, Kristen, since you represent a lot of large investors around the world. What realistic, I mean, you and I have had many discussions on this kind of stuff over many years, but in simple, brief terms, what could be done, if anything?
Well, I think it's a fascinating landscape, and I think ESG is going to be the key driver, which really starts to restate the paradigm and represents the problem and opens the door to new solutions. I really agree with Charlotte's earlier comments in that investors, we are a little bit damned if you do, damned if you don't. When no one asks tough questions when everyone's making money. And the very last thing the typical investment professional at a sovereign wealth fund wants is for part-time corporate administrative directors in an offshore jurisdiction to start telling their star portfolio manager what to do. Until something goes wrong, at which point the aforementioned front office investment professionals will probably be fired, but the remaining people within the organization are now left with a problem on their hands that will take multiple years to resolve through legal challenges. And one of the first questions is, well, where was the board? And that's fundamentally, we've got a lot of central questions here. Do you need external governance at all? Well, obviously the private equity industry says no, because they are structured as partnerships, not funds. If you do have governance, how active should the directors be in potentially making independent decisions that are not aligned with the preferences of the asset manager? I think a great case study recently actually is the case of the Woodford Income Fund. Now, Woodford is slightly different in that this was a UK domiciled fund where they had an authorized corporate director. So instead of individuals, we actually had equivalent to a representative entity in Australia. So you have a corporate entity, which in this case was Link Securities. And they proceeded to enable Neil Woodford to take a range of actions, notably seeking listings on the Channel Islands Stock Exchange in Guernsey for illiquid securities that are purely listings of listings of convenience rather than any active trading venue. And we're enabling the manager to have a material increase in the level of illiquid securities in an open-ended daily trading mutual fund, in essence. And now there's a lot of debate and criticism and potentially legal action against that authorized corporate director. But that is, in my mind, is a very helpful or relevant case study. The fund documents allowed a particular limit, and the regulatory environment, I think it allowed up to 15% in illiquid securities. So, if you go, I remember, Simon, we were at a conference once together in New York, and we had a great conversation with the director who said that, if the limit's 15%, if the manager goes from 1% illiquid to 14.98% illiquid in a month, that's still permitted under the terms of the offering document, and therefore I've discharged my duties by confirming that the asset manager remains within that specific threshold. And that ultimately comes to where we are going here of at what point are we bringing professional skepticism? At what point are we bringing forward-looking queries with respect to the governance process? Or are we really looking at more speed check, more binary testing around the role of the governance process? There aren't easy answers to complex questions, but obviously from an investment perspective, the more engaged the directors can be and the more ready they are to challenge the asset manager before things go off the rails, then that, in my mind, would be more effective governance.
Thank you. If I could I just jump into something Chris said there? And I just want to point to an element here. And Chris, I think you're right. I think that the key element here, of course, is your ability to focus your attention on these matters, right? So if the board has the time and the ability, the members of the board have the ability to execute and discharge their duties, then they're paying attention. They should be paying attention to those things. And I suspect that part of having the ability to exercise your duty, and to be able to do the job that you've been tasked with doing, is actually having the scope and the bandwidth to do it. And that comes down to sort of a high touch, if you will, role, and which really means a demonstrably lower number of appointments. And that is in so much as part of the regulatory framework as much as it is anything else. And I'd use a word, just substance, to describe that as a sort of umbrella term. You need more substance at those levels.
Can I, before we move on to other areas, which I do want to do, as I'm conscious of time is rapidly gathering on, anyone perhaps Charlotte, anybody else, do you think there isn't anything practical, realistic that can be done in almost bullet point type way to help make governance more interesting to investors, or not? And maybe the answer is no.
Can I answer to that?
Please, yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I mean, so I absolutely think that there is, but that's coming from me who thinks that governance is very important. I quite like it, not from a box ticking point of view, but for when you properly understand how to govern any organization anywhere in the world. It's not ticking boxes, it's just the music in the background. It works, it makes everybody more secure. And I think you don't need to be more than average intelligent to understand that governing an organization well is absolutely key, where you have proper risk oversight, you have proper independence, people can make decisions that are the best with regards to what they have been given, matters reserved for the board, all the basic stuff. For me, whether you're listed or unlisted, I expect to see the same governance levels on the boards that I serve on, for sure. And it really is not that difficult. None of this is rocket science, and I think there is no excuse really to just plant over it. What I see often is that, not to shoot at service providers, but service provider directors does not work very well. In my view, it's something I have refused to be on a board with service providers directors for many years. I'm not very popular for saying that, but they have a full-time job that they do alongside serving on a large number of boards, often hundreds of them. So they cannot discharge their duties. And when the brown stuff hits the fan, they are going to be leaning into their organization who pays them the salary and protect that position more than they're going to be leaning into protecting investors and their position. So that's one. I mean, very clearly, we should not be having any of that going on. I think it's easy to say no question should be asked why seemingly everything is good. However, we never find out until it's too late, right? It's not as if we find out when it's not good as it happens. We find out years down the line, and then we have to try to fix things after that. And therefore, if the directors haven't got the clout or the interest or the time to ensure that things are okay, and if it not, question it. Even if we have no power, we have the power of having a connection with the regulator, and we can go there and say, look, I'm leaving this board. I mean, for me, if I leave a board before my tenure, the regulator automatically now will ask questions because they understand that I wouldn't do that if things were okay. So it's generally a good pointer for a regulator that something is going wrong and I will be called in for an interview, right? Other directors will be the same. So that is good pointers for the investors that something is going wrong and they should start considering protecting their investment if nobody's telling them anything, because nobody does, right? As I said, until it's too late. So I think get transparency, understand who's on the board and how their independence lies. If they have not got any independence, consider why the manager feels that's appropriate and why the manager needs that. There's a lot of pointers in the kind of board that you have that tells you whether the manager is someone who is happy to be challenged or who just wants rubber stampers, right? There's a reason for everything, and this comes down to human behaviors, but a manager who has a need for rubber stampers and doesn't like challenge, why is that a manager you want to invest in?
Exactly, well, that's very well put. You mentioned transparency there, and can I move on to that and maybe come to you, Ekwe, with this, is that I'm constantly, frankly, amazed how difficult it is to get more transparency. I'd be interested in your views, everybody's views on this. And there's one particular jurisdiction where they've been fighting the transparency trend more than perhaps others. I want to ask your view whether you think, and everybody else too, by the way, whether more transparency would be helpful in the selection of directors, to document the selection of directors, in fund board composition, in fund boards positions. I mean, Chris and I have talked about over the years whether directors should be able to say if they're in Cayman, it should be publicly available how many boards they're actually on. Should this be publicly available information? Because frankly, it's not. And Charlotte just made the point, private funds and listed funds should be the same. They're nowhere near that. Sorry, the reason Guernsey and Jersey do very well by comparison is because you've got a big listed sector. But in other jurisdictions, such as the Caribbean one we're talking about, they don't have that. Ekwe, over to you.
So I think I do believe that transparency is very important. I think that once you see with the larger managers, there is a tendency to have the same board members on each of their funds, right? So instead of there's a conflict there. I think Lynn was talking about the apparent conflicts in directorships, but it's not only in the amount of boards that they do, but how many are concentrated under one investment manager or one fund umbrella, such that the director can tend to think about a problem and issue, not just in terms of one particular fund, but in terms of the fund complex. And when you're thinking about the fund complex, your alignment can tend to be more with the fund manager than it will be with any of the individual funds. So transparency and letting people know who it sits on the boards of all of your managers, right? I understand the reluctancy of fund managers, private fund managers, of having having information be public, but it should at the very least be available to your investors. How many, it should be in your reporting. If you have a board, how many of them are sitting on other funds of yours? It should be information that is kept. And I just want to quickly jump to something that Charlotte said. I think that investors, when they are thinking about fund governance, don't really understand that I spend my life doing very large side letters, right? All these investors want all of this information and want to know things in real time about what's happening with the fund. They want to be able to intervene if they think the fund is going in a direction that it's not supposed to be. Well, a good governance structure would relieve them of that duty to a certain extent. So I think that if they understood or knew that governance could be more than just a rubber stamp, could be more than just checking a box, then they would, my side letters would be shorter, which would be awesome. And they would get the results that they wanted without having to be so personal or so involved on such a minuscule level in the governance. You know, lots of big sovereign wealth or larger investors want to meet with managers monthly. Why can't you just insist that the board meet with your managers monthly, or insist that there is some sort of equivalent board in your Delaware partnership structure? These are things that investors have the power to do. And I think that if they were assured that the directors that were picked would actually have their interests in mind, that would be a much smoother process.
There's a question that's come in, which is making the other point of view from what we're all saying here, which I'll read out. Anyone please pick this up. Why should private funds domiciled offshore be required to become transparent? Surely this is a matter for the manager and his, interesting you use his investors only. And I'm gonna take the other point of view than I normally take. I'm going to represent that point of view. What business is it of anybody else? So I'm going to challenge everybody. I mean, you know, but I think someone should be challenging you guys on the panel. What if you want to have a private fund in, say, Cayman? You have a superstar manager in Connecticut. You have a couple of people on the board in Cayman who just do the admin work. Yeah, if you want to enjoy that structure and access that fantastic performance of that superstar manager in Greenwich, Connecticut, so what? What's the business? What business is it of the likes of IFI Global and they're coming along and trying to do analysis on fund board composition, and we should be able to tell them to get lost? What business is it of anybody? If investors want to come in on that, what's the problem? Anyone want to pick that up?
I'll jump in here. So for me, a lot of these funds are managing pension money, right? And pension funds are typically the retirement and wealth preservation vehicle for hardworking blue collar folk. Most of which look like me more than they look like the fund managers that are managing that money, right? And so while it is, definitely something that is, I can understand the tensions of not wanting this information to be public, but it does in fact good fund governance, or actually bad fund governance as well, does impact people outside of the actual investors in a fund, right? There are beneficial owners for which that performance, the way that the fund is run, actually has real impact. Also the global financial crisis informed us that these private funds have an immense impact on our economy, which affects everybody, right? And so while I am very sympathetic, I'm a funds lawyer. I am a private funds lawyer because I do not want to deal with the SEC on a daily basis. If I am dealing with the SEC, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong, right? That is not what I want. So I understand that. However, there needs to be a bit more cognizance in fund managers' minds about who they're ultimately serving, and the impact that their decisions ultimately fall to.
And I think that's a great point, if I can just quickly pop in, because effectively what all this trillions of investment money does, it affects all of us. We are all citizens of the same planet, and the kind of investments that goes through and how it's handled will potentially affect all of us. So I think it's not, nobody here can say that, oh, well, we're an island, we're not part of the rest of the world. Well, actually, we are all part of the same world, and I think the pandemic has shown us that. And I think climate change is going to show us that too. So I just don't think that we can say it's none of anybody's business. It is.
And I think,
business.
And to pick up on that point, I think from a jurisdictional perspective, jurisdictions need to be thinking about this. They need to be understanding that the world's changed. We're not where we were pre-financial crisis, and responding to the needs not just of managers, but actually of the ultimate underlying investors is going to be central in being able to continue to be able to deliver the services they want to deliver.
I think also just on that sort of last point is the actual legal obligation. So when you think about what a director is and fiduciary duties and the other duties that flow from that, I think there's a certain expectation back to Charlotte's point, that you're not just rubber stamping things, that you're actually looking at it and making sure that you're representing the entity as a board. And back to Chris's point, I think the questions aren't necessarily whether it's right or wrong, but what is maybe obligated by that jurisdiction, and are you actually undertaking that role with the practical implementation that people who see it may expect. So people will tout, for example, we have an independent fund board, or tout their governance. But then if you actually peek behind the curtain, maybe it's not as independent as you would like to see, or not as involved. So I think I don't know that there's a right answer or a wrong answer. I think it just involves governance itself, and what the expectation is versus what the delivery is.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, as always happens with these discussions, we gallop along, and we got with most of the agenda we've got to. So I'm going to ask you all to try and respond to the next couple of questions in the few minutes we have, in very short little soundbitey responses. We haven't really discussed enough, I don't think, in this hour, the whole impact of ESG on fund governance. We've been touching upon it in some respects. Is this the proverbial game changer? You can answer with a yes or no if you want. Anyone want to pick that one up? Chris, what do you think? You have an ESG newsletter that goes out, don't you?
Yeah, I think yes. I think that asset management across multiple dimensions will be a fundamentally different business in 2030 as compared to 2019, and amidst a very, very broad mosaic of issues. The role of the board, the composition of the board, the cognitive diversity of the board, the ability of a fund to more accurately reflect the diversity and be inclusive with respect to the ultimate end beneficiaries who are providing the assets held within those funds. Those will be non-negotiable and will be profoundly different at the end of this decade than where they were in the beginning.
Okay, anybody else want to answer that one? I've got a couple more questions. Anyone want to chip in on that before the next one?
I can just really quickly say, for me, the E and the S are now integrated parts of any point of the agenda, and as it should be. Net zero, we now have service providers being asked if they're vegans or not, because apparently meat eaters weigh heavier towards a net zero 2050. Just want to throw that out there.
We should have put that on our questionnaire, Lynn, which we're doing with the survey. We're doing great. We didn't have any vegan questions. I'm sorry about that. All right, I'm going to move on. We had a big debate in the prep call on what is the purpose of fund governance, and we touched upon it in one of the results from the investors, and there was an exchange of views on that. Is it first and foremost to protect, when they diverge, the interests of the fund or the interests of investors? And you can say investors or fund if you can keep it really short. Anyone want to do that? Anyone sticking up for fund? You were sticking up for fund, Philip.
I was, but I was making a specific distinction that the board is responsible for the fund, and that indirectly that's for the investor's benefit. And I wanted to take the exception I was making is that the fund is not analogous to the manager. Okay. So that's a key distinction to be made, and it's often confused by all of the parties that are involved in the structure. And that's the point I was trying to drive at.
Lynn, were you looking like you wanted to say
something? I was,
something?
This is another question that has come up just in discussions, but I think, the board needs to represent the fund, which in most circumstances, as you noted, as Philip noted, is everything is aligned. But in the crises, when we talk about, dropping the gate, liquidity issues, things like that, the board really has the obligation to the fund as a whole and to the functioning entity of the fund. And unfortunately, the decisions about gates and redemptions and things like that investors may find very hard to stomach in a case of crisis are actually being made in the interest of the preservation of the vehicle itself, which ultimately, again, I think most people would equate to the benefit of all of the investors. But in a circumstance like that, if they elect a gate provision or some other thing that may not be in the best interests of the investors, but at the preservation of the fund, I think that's essentially doing their job as a director. And I think some investors coming out of 2008 felt really that the board had not served them correctly by allowing the implementation of some of the maybe not so investor friendly policies.
Thank you. Now we've literally got seconds left. I'm going to try and be ambitious in the seconds we've got. I asked one question and there's a couple of comments on the Q&A I'm going to read out at the very end, because we haven't got onto my variability of standards. And I want to ask you, does it matter? Trust me, and when I did those averages earlier, it masks the reality. There are plenty of boards out there with no independence on. There's plenty of boards, very good boards, completely independent. There's all sorts of things in between. There's different, there's no standardization. Just trust me, we've done the analysis, there isn't. Here's the question, does it matter? Because it doesn't seem to matter to the industry right now. Anyone think, and if it does matter, what can be done about it?
If you asked that, Simon, if you asked that question in January of 2009, everyone would have said it really matters. And this is a point Charlotte made earlier. It's just now that things have been going along so well that people seem to forget that those things matter.
So it
So
doesn't
in
matter
crisis,
right
it
now.
matters.
Absolutely.
It matters.
It matters, but okay, what can be done about it? You got one word to answer that. What can really, is it the regulator? What has to happen?
I think it's
something about.
It's comprehensive. It's the regulator. So it's the jurisdiction. It's the regulator. It's the deep pool of talent. It's choosing a place to structure where you know you have full substance underlying the vehicle that you've established there.
Right.
It's also
But the investors should also have an interest, right? I'm so sorry. Investors should have an interest. It's extraordinary they don't. They do when it goes wrong, right? Then they're all over us.
And
I'm going to read out two comments before we close this, which are more comments than questions that we've got in. One is a very good comment. Investors might be more interested in fund governance if they had more contact with directors. That's one comment. And somebody from presumably Cayman's said, given the, she's given her name, Rebecca Palmer, wherever she may be, given the direction of the discussion on transparency, it would be helpful to clarify that in Cayman, there are strict director registration requirements and you are required to register appointments to register funds with the regulator. Okay, on that note, I mean, you don't have to respond to that. I wanted to thank you all very much for a very lively discussion. Sorry it's been so short as it often is. Thank you all of you around the world for following us, and we will have a recording of this being put up, and if you want the results of the research, will be in much more detail. We'll have that ready in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Thank you particularly to Jersey Finance for sponsoring this, and we will be back, hopefully in the States in person in the autumn, if not by this mechanism or both maybe. Thank you all, and see you the next time. Have a good afternoon, evening, or wherever you may be. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you.